This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm delighted you're here. On behalf of the Disability Studies Initiative of Emory University, I'm honored and happy to introduce you this afternoon to Eva Feder-Kittay, who is in residency with us here in the Emory Disability Studies Initiative through this week and is the featured speaker in our spring cultural event. Eva will be participating in a number of other events, all of which are listed on the Disability Studies website and on the really classy poster, which is somewhere in here, that many copies of are all over campus. So please, I encourage you to visit the website. The web address is here. It's disabilitystudies@emory.edu, and to consider joining us for all of our disability studies events, and also for letting other people know about these wonderful events. So I'd like to also thank, of course, our sponsors, co-sponsors for today, the Laney Graduate School New Leaders and New Thinkers Fund, the Hightower Fund, the Center for Ethics, where we are now, the Nell Hodgson Woodruff School of Nursing, and the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Always good supporters and good sponsors. So I want to introduce you today to Eva in two ways. First, the conventional way, which will give you a sense of what distinguished really means in an academic setting. So Eva Feder-Kittay is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Stony Brook University, SUNY. In addition, she is a Senior Fellow of the Stony Brook Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics, and she's an affiliate of the Women's Studies program. Her areas of specialization, get this list, are feminist philosophy, feminist ethics, social and political theory, metaphor, disability studies, as well as the philosophy of language, normative ethics, social thought, and to this list I will add bioethics, and I will add feminist bioethics, and I'll talk more about that. Her publications are many and distinguished. Her books include such important ones as Women and Moral Theory, which came out in 1987, Frames, Fields, and Contrasts from 1992, and perhaps her most well-known book that I'll speak a little bit about, Love's Labor, Essays on Women, Equality, and Dependency from 1999. She's also written a book, or edited a book, with Ellen Feder on the subject of care, and a new book, which is very interesting and important, in 2010 called Cognitive Disability and the Challenge to Moral Philosophy. I want to also introduce Eva in a second way, in order to highlight her contribution to disability studies, because we are the Emory Disability Studies Initiative. And to do that, what I wanted to do is to take a moment to give a more personalized introduction in the form of a bit of a short history of my own coming into consciousness about disability identity, disability rights. And I want to suggest with this intellectual biography, so to speak, how the conversation that Eva has contributed to so powerfully has shaped disability studies and has shaped my own contributions to that field of study. So Eva has been building knowledge about feminist disability studies, even when it wasn't called that, from the early 1970s. And she's done so through a conversation about disability, dignity, dependency, interdependence, autonomy, justice, and the meaning of human variation. And she'll be talking about all those topics through all of the events this week. I entered this conversation somewhere around 1982, not as a participant or a contributor to the conversation, but a recipient of that conversation. Now, I'd always thought of myself as a feminist. Until the mid-1980s, actually, I'd been asleep about what we now call the relationship between gender and disability. Actually, I'd been asleep about a lot of things. So somewhere before 1982, I had even though I was asleep, read Simone Beauvoir's memoirs, mostly because I was interested in Camus and Sartre. But I'd also found The Second Sex, and I'd read that. And along the way, it had introduced me to what we now call structural sexism, even though I don't think I understood it very fully at the time. But for me, it was Carol Gilligan's book, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, which had come out in 1982, that changed everything about the way I thought. It made me recognize, and this is the important point, that women's gendered experience could lead them to understanding and enacting human relationships in positive rather than negative ways. This is the key. That concept that might make something positive in the world and something positive in the world and help people understand themselves grew for me out of what we now call the movement of cultural feminism, from which much work from Carol Gilligan followed. The books that we call cultural feminism now were forming the way I was thinking about disability, and they were part of a conversation that contained and was developing in Eva's own work. So here are some of the books that you may have read in the context of cultural feminism in which Eva's work was contextualized. One was Jean Baker Miller's book, Toward a New Psychology of Women, Nancy Chartereau's book, The Reproduction of Mothering, Sarah Ruddock's book, Maternal Thinking, Toward a Politics of Peace. The strain of thought that was bringing me from feminism to feminist disability studies achieved its own transformation into feminist disability studies, although of course no one was calling it that then, with the book by Adrienne Ash and Michelle Fine called Women with Disabilities, Essays in Psychology, Culture, and Politics, which came out in 1998. And then Eva's book, Love's Labor, Essays on Equality, Women, and Dependency, which came to us in 1999. My own development incorporated into these early proto-feminist disability studies the work we think of as vulnerability theory as well, which inflects what we now call the feminist ethics of care, with the thinking of Martha Feynman in her book called The Autonomy Myth, A Theory of Dependency, and Brian Turner's work, Vulnerability and Human Rights, which came out, both of which came out in the first decade of the 21st century. So I want to end my genealogy here, and I wanted to list those books that I see Eva's work being embedded in and being a part of the conversation of. And I want to end this genealogy with two quotes about what Eva taught me about feminist disability, bioethics, and feminist disability studies. And in doing so, I want this to be a summary honoring of my friend and my colleague and an introduction of Eva Kittay. So first is a quote from Love's Labor about mothering a daughter with disabilities. And these are Eva's words. We didn't realize how much she would teach us, but we already knew that we had learned something. That which we believed, we valued, what I thought was at the very center of humanity, the capacity for thought and for reason, was not it at all. The second quote is from her wonderful recent essay in Hypatia, the Journal of Feminist Philosophy, called Forever Small. It's about the strange case of Ashley X. If you don't know about the strange case of Ashley X, I suggest that you read Eva's article, in which she says, and this was so clarifying for me, and I quote, "The perspective from a life lived with disability should be the primary evidence in bioethical decision-making." It's that simple. So I want to leave you here with Eva's words and take you into her lecture today, which is entitled Normalcy and a Good Life, Problems, Prospects, and Possibilities in the life of people with severe cognitive disabilities. Thank you, Eva.
I want to say there are large print copies available for anybody who would benefit from reading along. So if anybody would like that, I can give some.
Well, first of all, Rosemary, I just want to say, wait, is this live? No, this is live. You got it exactly right. I didn't start working on questions of disability until really the mid-1990s. So I already had a long career in philosophy where I didn't deal with disability at all. And it was truly Gilligan's work and the work that issued from Gilligan's work, I mean, my thinking that developed from Gilligan's work, that was the hook for me to enter into the discussion of philosophy, my experiences with a severely cognitively disabled person. Because those two things, philosophy and cognitive disability, don't normally sit in the same sentence. Excuse me, I will take my water. So you have it exactly right. That's exactly the contextualization of my work. So I want to thank Rosemary and Ben Reese and Joel Reynolds and the many who've made it possible for me to visit Emory. It's a great honor and a very great pleasure. I know I'll learn a lot during this visit, and I hope I'll be able to give something in return for all which I receive. This talk is part of a book I've been writing for a while now, and it's in some ways the culmination of my thinking about the relationship between philosophy and what I have learned from my daughter. Now, precisely the passage that you picked out. And this is this is one piece of a chapter. So among these is the role that normal plays in our life and in our philosophy. Most philosophy is written from the perspective of the normal and presumes the normal. And furthermore, this notion of the normal has a connection to a perennial problem in philosophy, and that is what makes a life a good life. Can you all hear me as I bop up and down with my head? Okay. So let me begin with a quote. Okay. This is from a parent of a child with disabilities who wrote an op-ed page in the Washington Post. Having a child with a severe disability makes of every parent a philosopher. Well, what if you already are a philosopher and are raising a child with multiple and severe disabilities, including severe cognitive disabilities? You become a humbler philosopher. Having a child with a severe disability makes of every parent a philosopher because it makes one search anew for what makes life worth living. A philosophical question, if ever there was one. Yet disability, and especially intellectual disability, has never been featured in the problem set of philosophy's canonical works. To broach the question of what a good life can be and what kind of good life can be had, by people with these sorts of disabilities, and whether a good life must fall within the range of the normal, I've had to break with philosophy's implicit disapproval of a subjectively based inquiry. This lecture, then, is at once a story and an argument, and it's an argument in which the story, personal as it is, plays an intrinsically important role. Quality of life does not equal quantity of skill. I've written about disability since the late 1990s, and my focus has been on what I know best: significant cognitive disability. I know it best because I've lived with it. It is the disability of my daughter, Sasha. And now the slide shows a picture of my daughter. Somehow the A, curiously out of place. Okay. Having a disability as part of your life is epistemologically rich. Even for a disability scholar, becoming a mother of a disabled child shows you what you thought you had known previously and what you know now are of an entirely different order. And this slide shows a child pressing against an opaque glass, opaque and distorting glass. Many who watch from the sidelines see an abnormal child who's unlikely ever to achieve parents' normal hopes and expectations, and whose family is condemned to struggle. Without wishing to diminish the struggle of either the child or the family, I want to convey how much quality can be had from a life without what many take to be a normal life. And I have a contrasting photo there of a disabled child with a caregiver and joyful expressions on each. Let me say what I mean when I speak of people with cognitive disabilities. People with severe cognitive disabilities process their world and experiences atypically. They experience a range of human possibilities that are only partially available or not salient for others. They have a greater degree of dependence on another's care. They challenge the idea of humanity as fully functioning, rational, independent, and productive. Yet they are capable of experiencing a rich joy in their lives, even though life is not always joyful and sometimes painful and frightening. But can people with disabilities, these sorts of disabilities, have a good life? A philosopher wants to approach this question by first asking what constitutes the good in life. Philosophers, of course, have had quite a bit to say about the good life. We may begin with Aristotle. The activity of the divinity which surpasses all others in bliss must be a contemplative activity. And the human activity which is most closely akin to it, therefore most conducive to happiness, Happiness is coextensive with study. Consequently, happiness is some sort of study or contemplation. The notion here, which has been variously developed, is that the good life requires the development of the rational capacity, which is viewed as essential to being human. A more capacious Aristotelian view is that of Martha Nussbaum. This broader conception is found in Nussbaum's list of capabilities, and these include things like play, closeness to the animal world, affinitive relationships, along with the more traditional capacities cited by philosophers. But even she believes that, quote, a truly human life, unquote, that is, a life of good quality, must be must include the ability to be a practical reasoner. Societies, she claims, have an obligation to provide their inhabitants with the freedom to exercise all the capabilities, and that within a fully just society, even those with severe cognitive disabilities should be given every possibility of developing them, no matter the cost. Notice that now this becomes another typical philosophical view of a good life. What it fails to account for are those who cannot, no matter the effort or cost, acquire that capacity, or at least give any evidence of that capability. Their life, she concludes, is very unfortunate, perhaps tragic. Is this right? By the time I'd given birth to my daughter and learned of her disabilities, I was fully convinced that the unexamined life was not worth living. And here I have a picture of Socrates. Yet once I became her parent, there was no question in my mind that her life was worth living, that I would do everything in my power to preserve her life, protect her from any further harm, and love her as the child of mine that she is. This was foundational and brought me to the understanding that the values I held high above all others, the love of reason, the capacity to act rationally, the role of reason in a worthy and moral life, were not at the center of a life of meaning and value. Sesha's life, without the ability to be a practical reasoner, was not a tragedy, and it was my business to make sure it never became so. If the experience of parenting my disabled daughter had a sting, it was like Socrates' gadfly. And here I have a little picture of a gadfly, constantly throwing doubt on deeply held beliefs. How can one unquestionably read and teach texts that give reason the pride of place when each day one interacts with a wonderful human being who displays no indisputable evidence of the capacity to reason? How can one view language as the very mark of humanity when this same daughter can speak not a word? How can one argue that our moral worth as ends in themselves or as persons are predicated on the capacity of reason when that would mean that my daughter did not have intrinsic worth? One can argue, as some have, that life itself is of inestimable value. Being alive, no matter how impaired, is better than no life at all. But when we have a child, we want her not merely to live, but to have a life. That is to say, a life worth living. Clearly, if only the exercise of our rational capacities makes a human life worth living, then humans with severe cognitive disabilities are excluded by definition. Notice that I've switched from speaking of the good life to speaking of a good life. We don't need to debate whether the capacity to be reasoners or to be practical reasoners is necessary for the good life if the aim is to seek instead just a good life. A good life surely allows for a more pluralistic set of values. And I'm certainly not speaking of just a minimally acceptable life, meaning a life, however poor, still preferable to death. A good life can and should be much more than minimally acceptable. It seems to many that having a child with severe cognitive disabilities must impede the life of both the individual, herself, and her family. One can point first to severe behavioral problems, as we sometimes see in the case of autism, even when the degree of intellectual disability is not severe. The behavioral disabilities characteristic of some children with autism may be due to perceptual sensitivities that make many ordinary sensory experiences intolerable. Research into the lives of parents with disabled children has indicated that especially hard to control aggressive and violent behavior is highly correlated with familial stress. Second, levels of pain may well make life harder to endure. Some syndromes are paired with degenerative conditions in which the children experience a great deal of pain and a very short life. And Tay-Sachs and Nyman are frequently cited examples. No one can gloss over these forms of suffering and the consequent diminishment of the quality of the life of the child and family alike. Third, some children, including many on the autism spectrum, have difficulties with physical affection. However, many who are not cognitively impaired live rich lives yet do not appear to want or tolerate much physical affection. In each of these situations, however, it's not the cognitive impairments as such that are the source of a diminished quality of life. Parents of children with significant cognitive disabilities, when we meet each other, we feel like we're part of a special club. We recognize each other's sorrows and pains. We hear in each other's voices a special, poignant sort of love for our children. Even in the midst of harrowing stories of pain, the agony and anger of enduring incompetence, indifference, and punishing attitudes on the part of others, there's a terror that we would lose this child. Even though acknowledging the hardships, lack of support, family breakups, parents speak almost always of the joy that this child can experience and the joy that the child brings into their lives. We also tend to have a different relationship to expectations and that the child do something. Although we and the therapists and teachers and other professionals involved in their lives are continually trying to teach our children skills, many of us have come to appreciate a life without preconceived expectations. The evidence of a skill or a capacity is a surprise and a delight, but so is the ability just to be, to take life in. Love, joy, and the gift of just being able to be. I'll speak more of them later. It's not easy being not normal. Problems. Normal is such a benign word when things are normal. It's a cutting one when things are not. When the norm of normal is met, the term is deceptively descriptive. When it fails to be met, the normative and judgmental meaning is apparent, sometimes brutally so. When used against an individual who fails to meet that norm, the word can feel like a bludgeon, an excuse to accuse, condemn, exclude, or denigrate. I feel I have a special claim to the question of normality from the child's perspective, as well as the parents. For as a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, I wanted, above all, to be normal. Born into a time when the world was recovering from the Second World War, stability and normalcy was the order of the day. In the aftermath of the chaos and disruption of war, there was a profound desire to achieve predictability with rigid norms. And here's a picture of my parents with me in Sweden in 1946, I think. The normal 50s. There's a scene out of early Mad Men episode here in Don Draper's kitchen. Betty Draper is entertaining her very respectable housewife neighbors, one of whom is very visibly pregnant. Conformity to a singular norm was reinforced by television, movies, magazines, policed by scrutinizing neighbors, and maintained by stigmatizing and excluding those who did not fit in. It was a stifling atmosphere in which immigrants, Holocaust survivors and their children, people with disabilities, homosexuals, the political left, and so many others could scarcely breathe the air of freedom for which the war was fought. The 50s gave way to the 60s, and the vistas opened. And here I have an image of the 60s mashup in the style of Peter Max, for those of you who know it, but psychedelic art is the style. In this profound historical moment, it seemed as if all those excluded took center stage, as their concerns became the subject of popular songs and pop culture. Their movements captured the headlights. The normal changed. Some, like myself, suddenly felt as if we belonged to the American narrative. When I became the parent of a child who, as it happened, turned out to have very significant cognitive disabilities, and there's a picture here of Sesha as a month-old infant, the desire for normalcy once again held me in its thrall. The desire for normalcy was at the heart of the pain and despair that so tore our hearts in those early days. Donna Thompson gives voice to the experience when she writes of learning about her son's disability. Tears glistened on the doctor's cheeks as she told me my baby was severely disabled. Never be normal are the words I remember. I looked down and something red caught my eye. Blood was oozing from the edge of my thumbnail where I had bitten it. She then recalls the words from a man who lost almost his entire family in an auto crash. I had the experience of falling victim to random tragedy and a serious derailment of one's life's plans, which caused such profound shock and questioning of all I believed was solid and true. It's not that all that solid melts into air, it's just all that solid comes crashing down on your head. Why does the news that your child is not normal, and most especially is significantly cognitively impaired, involve such a profound shock, such an upheaval of, well, everything? The emotional intensity and impossibility of comprehending what has happened. Why? When the source of the anguish is not death, but abnormality. Perhaps only one who is habituated to asking why would ever challenge what seems an indisputable loss. We want health, opportunities, and general well-being for our child. How will this child grow into an adult that others can love and cherish? Will she be viewed as a valuable and valued member of society, included as a full citizen, not merely a pitiful charity case? That Sesha's life did not have to become tragic was at first not clear to us. She was so vulnerable. Would she be safe? She would not be able to form a family or have an intellectual life or a work of her own. Mostly, would this child grow into an adult that others can love and cherish? Some of our worries were well warranted. She must still be watched at all times. She must be protected from harming herself. She's never learned to put her hands out to protect her face when she falls. And because of a fall, she now has a permanent bridge for her front teeth. When we asked the dentist what would happen, because these are hooked into her jaw, what would happen if she fell again? And he replied, she can't fall, period. More frightening still is that she's utterly powerless against another's malevolent intent. Our normal capacities are employed for self-protection. Sesha is entirely vulnerable for the lack of those capacities. We are saddened that important and so-called normal desires of hers will remain unfulfilled. We've seen her look smitten at some young man. We've seen her look longingly, got it? Longingly at a baby. And there's a picture here of Sesha looking longingly, lovingly at her baby nephew. Would she want that for herself? I cannot know. The parental tasks that philosopher Sarah Ruddick defined as preservative love, fostering growth, and socializing the child for acceptance by the community are more challenging in the case of disability. Does this mean that a good life is impossible in the absence of the normal? There we go. Not quite. We have developed with Sesha. We have learned to distinguish the common understanding of a good life from a normal life, those two concepts that seemed so inseparable. Many of the concerns that we had originally had have, for the most part, faded. For example, rather than a desire for employment for her, we can help her master a task or feel a sense of self-efficacy when she succeeds in communicating a need or a desire. And here's Sesha in her Up and Go gait trainer, which she loves. In place of our concern for an intellectual life, we see her able to have other joys, the enjoyment of water, of food, of music, of love, and of seeing a fun music. There's a picture of Sesha in a movie theater watching Rio. We now have at least a partial answer to why we desire the normal. The desire that refuses to go away is then first a desire to have one's own worth and that of one's children confirmed. In this, acceptance is tightly linked to a sense of self-worth. We depend on the willingness of others to recognize our worth and what we value. We require the affirmation of a community that what we are and what we value are in fact valuable. Without that recognition, we are in constant jeopardy, both in a psychological and a physical sense. We are in danger of self-contempt and of being held in contempt by the community. Worse still, that which is not recognized as worthy is also not granted the protection of the community. Furthermore, isolation or rejection from one's community is, for social creatures such as humans, itself a form of harm. Our flourishing requires the companionship and love only possible together with others. Just one reason the whole notion of inclusion is so terribly important and front and center in the disability movement. Yet, as much as each of us desires normalcy, most of us will, with some cheerful self-deprecation and sometimes with satisfaction, say, ours is not a normal life. There's a certain pride we take in not being normal. Claiming normalcy is admitting to a banality, a lack of distinctiveness, and so distinction. If all I can say about myself is that I'm normal, I have to wonder about the individuality of that I. It's, I think, the familiar dialectic of sameness and difference that is at the heart of this ambivalence. The ambivalence reflects an ambiguity in the concept itself. the normal is both a statistical norm and an aspirational norm. Leonard Davis traces how excellence traces how prevalence replaces excellence as marking the new aspirational norm. He claims that the aspirational norm shifted from the ideal to the normal in the 19th century with the ascendance of statistical analysis. And there's a picture of sort of a normal woman. But if the goddess signifies a transcendental ideal, unattainable by mere mortal women, the magazine model represents a new aspirational norm, which should be attainable by any woman, but rarely, of course, is. It's an elision from the statistical norm to the aspirational norm. To the extent that we deviate from her, a woman feels herself less than desirable, but also less than normal. Thus, the statistical norm has become the aspirational norm. This is what a normal woman should look like. The normal, presumably a descriptive statistical fact, therefore, nonetheless acquires a prescriptive force. This new sort of ideal takes its prescriptive force from frequency rather than excellence. The bell curve, also known as the normal curve, and that's what I'm showing right there. I don't know how to use the pointer on this thing. Anyway. It represents here the normal distribution of IQs. I think that's what the bell curve was particularly used for. But it can be used as a representation of the distribution of traits, generally. It's a representation in a seemingly descriptive sense. Everything that deviates from the midpoint, let's see if I can get this. Is this thing? This thing? No. Is there a? No, there's no pointer on this. Okay. Everything that deviates from the midpoint deviates from the norm. Now, there's something called the ogive curve, and this represents cumulative frequencies. And the left side of the bell curve is represented as the bottom half of the ogive curve. Well, the right side is represented as the top half. Representing frequencies of IQs in the ogive curve moves us from low IQs to high IQs. Rather than speaking of deviations from the norm, we note that we ascend the cumulative curve as we go from the fewest represented to those to the most represented as we ascend to the more desirable. Each point on that ogive curve pulls in more individuals. Right? So it makes it seem as if the only people who are really abnormal are those below the curve. They both give us, in many ways, the same information, but there's an important difference in the representation of that information. Right? In the normal curve here, there's no better or worse on the two sides of the curve, right? Whereas there's a clear representation of which way we want to go in the ogive curve. To employ the terms of the French historian of science, Georges Canguilhem, normal appears to be an objective judgment of reality, yet it becomes a subjective judgment of value. When the judgment of reality becomes a judgment of value, we take the way things are, or suppose that they are, to be an approximate realization of the way things ought to be. Right? Remember the model. We think that that's the way it ought to be, and we presume that that's how things are. The way things are, then, defines for us the good we desire. We have said effectively that what is normal is what is desirable and what is good. The claim that we desire normalcy comes close to being a tautology, as does the idea that the non-normal, taken here to be the pathological, is not a good one can desire. It amounts to saying that we desire what is desirable. But it remains puzzling, however, why we should ever desire what's most frequent. Medicine, for example, provides us with numerous examples where the statistically frequent condition is less desirable than rarer instances. Older adults who have blood pressure levels which are more common in younger people than in older people are rare, but they're decidedly better off for the deviation. There are different ways we can deviate from a norm. Not all deviations are pathologies, right? Which are undesirable and by definition, undesirable by definition. And as such, they're judgments of value. Canguilhem here was thinking particularly in terms of medicine. They may be, these atypicalities may be mere variations or non-pathological anomaly. They're not conceptually marked as undesirable. But Canguilhem suggests that the descriptive statistical sense, the judgments of reality, are not free of value judgments either. Canguilhem reverses the usual way we think of the relationship of a norm to an average. He writes that the norm is not deduced from, but rather expressed in the average. As counterintuitive as this may at first sound, some examples may point out how this could be. So consider the normal lifespan. In the US today, it's 78 years old. It's about 78 years, I believe. But were we to receive improved nutrition, good day-to-day care, appropriate medical services, and good safety measures, we could move that normal lifespan to closer to 100. The standard of care is itself a product of social values, and it plays a role in determining the statistical norm. There's a historical example. In the early, late 19th century till the mid-20th century, Martha's Vineyard became home to a large population of deaf persons. Many people in this room are probably aware of this. The reason was twofold. The first was biological, the appearance of a particularly prominent genetic feature in some of the population. But the second was social. Deaf individuals were neither marginalized nor shunned. They had normal lives, married, and bore children, thereby contributing to the future population of the island. Had the contemporary norms of the wider culture prevailed in Martha's Vineyard, deafness would not have acquired a measure of normality, so much so that when people were asked, was such and such a person deaf, many people couldn't tell you. They really had to think about, was this person deaf? The point, would not have acquired a measure of normality, and it would have not become so statistically significant. The point here is that even seemingly objective and descriptive statistical norms may really reflect values. Thus, the desire to fall within a statistical norm is less baffling. We desire to be part of a statistical norm because the statistical norm already marks that which is valued and desired. Canguilhem states, a human trait would not be normal because frequent, but frequent because normal. That is, normative in a given kind of life. Although statistical frequency often already reflects what is socially valued, it still doesn't fully account for the stigmatization of even simple variations or anomalies, such as having an extra digit, or facial hair on women, or red patch visible on the face, or short stature. These are basically non-pathological atypicalities with little functional disadvantage. Again, why is the merely common valorized over these deviations? Another reason for the stigma is that the statistical norm becomes the basis for social norms and institutions. Because heterosexual men and women are statistically prevalent, social institutions have been ordered to fit them. Being homosexual then is disadvantageous and affects one's functionality, even if in a different environment one could function perfectly well. People with achondroplasia, even if there's no accompanying medical condition, are disabled by the environment built for the so-called averaged height. The environment renders them disabled. This is the point, of course, of the social model of disability. And like differently gendered people, this issues in a danger. Lisa Headley, the mother of a daughter with achondroplasia, remarked as she pondered limb-lengthening surgery for her child, "There's a certain amount of safety in being normal. So as her guardian and protector, I'm vulnerable to the enticing possibilities of a surgical fix that might bring her closer to that safety zone of normalcy. The desire for normalcy is at least in part a desire to reside in the safety zone marked out by the normal." The danger arises out of an intolerance to difference. The relationship between desirability and that which is statistically normal throws a new light on this intolerance. For a certain norm to be maintained, deviations from the norm are seen as undesirable. And nothing is desirable if no one desires it. The refuseniks. Part of what is so shocking, and the term is well chosen, about disabled people's claim that their disability does not render them tragic, is that it disrupts the seemingly self-evident desirability of the typical body. Those who refuse a cure, or still worse, contemplate selecting for a child with a disability, as some deaf couples have done, are nothing short of a scandal. While we can coerce someone to comply with a norm, we cannot coerce their desire, which is, of course, precisely what's being demanded. Coercing desire recalls Nietzsche's critique of the normal. And here I have a picture of Nietzsche, and below him, below that, a picture of a herd of sheep. Nietzsche called the need to be normal the herd instinct, the need to obey, to follow commands, to acquiesce to authority. And the picture he painted remains unattractive, reminding us of how undesirable the normal sometimes looks. But if normalcy sometimes looks undesirable, then it's not tautological that the desire for the normal is the desire for the desirable. And yet, while humans are predators, they're also prey. And as vulnerable beings, acting in conformity with the group is both self-protective and may be in the interest of everyone. In ethical terms, it may be, under some, perhaps even most circumstances, prudent for the individual and for the group as a whole. Without some standards of normalcy, we risk behaviors that can become massively destructive. Of course, we also know the destructiveness of acting with the herd against the scapegoats. But without norms of health or proper nutrition, we lack means of assessing conditions that can and should be ameliorated. Norms also make our own and others' actions intelligible to us. Without norms, in short, we risk unleashing a Pandora's box of subjectivism, relativism, and nihilism. The prospects for normalization. So, are those with severe disabilities, especially cognitive disabilities, to be excluded from the norms that are desirable? Do they stand outside of all norms? Can and should we find ways to normalize what, by some standards and some norms, are deviations? And if we should, what can normalization mean and how can it be accomplished? The idea of normalization, first introduced in Scandinavia and made widely known by the Canadian educator Wolfenberger, at once tried to hold the content of the norm fixed, but find ways to extend its scope. People with cognitive disabilities were not to be viewed as different or special and so segregated and treated like lifelong children. The movement promoted the idea of age-appropriate activities and normal settings with the needed supports. It called for deinstitutionalization and was behind the idea of inclusion. And many of these efforts have immensely improved the lives of so many. Wolfenberger's normalization, while it forced us to think more creatively about how to include those excluded into existing norms, norms presupposed in visions of the good life, we need more. We need to find ways to challenge stifling norms, ones that inhibit the flourishing of individuals and individuality. We need new values that can become the basis of the new normal, a new normal, with its own source of desirability. We need to establish norms that are more capacious. The task is not without difficulties. Values, like language, requires what Wittgenstein called stage setting. But this stage setting cannot be the work of an isolated individual. We alone cannot change norms. It presupposes and requires a community who shares practices and purposes. But just where do we find such a community when conforming to the norm is the norm? As daunting as the challenge is, we meet it all the time. We do so because we must. For those who are not regarded as normal, the ability to lead satisfactory and even flourishing lives depends on the expansion of normality, so that we have some sense of stability, of normalization. How do we do this? When a situation or person does not fit the normal, it's not because all norms are violated. Some expectations of normality are met, while others are not. The abnormal situation I found myself with the birth of a child diagnosed as severely to profoundly cognitively disabled, the term was mental retardation, of course, still involved much that was normal about motherhood. I too had gone through pregnancy and childbirth, just as most mothers. I too had an infant to nurture and love. Like any mother is supposed to, I was intent on doing well by my child, doing as well by my child as possible. She was, for me, first of all, my daughter, not a disabled child. I had to attend to her in her particularity, and the particular features of her ability and disability were equally important. I had to understand what was normal for her. And as a family, we had to create a normality that we could live with. When my daughter was diagnosed, we were urged by well-meaning people to give her up, place her elsewhere, and live a normal life. But my partner and I were already madly in love with our child. In this regard, we felt very much like a normal father, a normal mother and a normal father. And giving up a child was not part of that norm. And I have here a picture of me and my spouse with baby Sesha. My spouse and I found those friends who accepted our family as a family. We dealt with our extended family's discomfort, found the physicians, therapists, schools, teachers who were accepting. With their help, we located our daughter's baseline and her trajectory. We learned to appreciate small steps in development and took as much joy in these as parents take when their children get A's. Sesha was living her life as she experienced it. Her life was normal for her. She could enjoy her food, she's a real gourmet, love the infection showered on her, water play, enjoy water play, giggle at silly children's songs, pull her brother's hair, and watch him cry. My son always insists that that was totally intentional, and so on. We, her parents, refused the pity of those who could not understand, and we refused the attempts of others to sanctify us, to call us remarkable or saintly, insisting instead that we were only doing what we assumed a parent normally would do: care for, love, protect, and foster the growth of one's child. But while we worked to socialize her as best we could, we also worked, and still do work, to socialize the surrounding community to accept her. We tried to extend the sense of normalcy to our other child, and he likewise found a way, his way, to normalizing his birth family by his choice of friends, by his understanding of his role in the family, and his understanding of what a sister can be. In those early years, I had nothing acceptable to hang my imagination on. Those who are anomalous can work to redefine the normal, to create their own sense of normalcy, and locate those from whom they can find validation and support. These provide the foundation for a good life for those who fall outside of existing norms. Doing so requires creating bridges from what is already acceptable and accepted to oneself as normal to new situations and new norms. Creating or finding a community to support your own construction of the normal. Finding a community both for subjective and objective supports and resources. Engaging in critical political work of expanding notions of normalcy, making norms less rigid, forming alliances. So, what of the good life? In what can it consist? We have grown with Sesha, learned from her and her centeredness, her composure, her strengths. Some of Sesha's interests have remained the same, some have matured. She's still a gourmet, very appreciative of excellent food. Her tastes in music have matured with her, and she no longer listens to Raffi and Barney, but Bach, Beethoven, Schubert, Louis Armstrong, Bob Dylan, Elvis Presley, and Michael Jackson, amongst others. One needs nothing more than to watch this woman who has no language, who is still incontinent, who cannot feed, dress, or in any way care for herself, listen to a Bach partita, a Schubert fantasy, one of her beloved Broadway musicals, or best of all, watch her thrill to the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth, to discern the riches in her life. She listens to music the way I do when I go to a concert. Sesha is one of the privileged in a world full of misery, violence, and privation, lives robbed of dignity and quality. To staunch the oozing of pity for this abnormal, severely to profoundly cognitively disabled woman, one has only to witness Sesha and myself in a round of kisses and embraces and see the joy that emanates from her. And there's a picture of Sesha and me in an embrace. And this is normalcy in our household. Our sense of normalcy, however, can fall apart, if only for a moment, when we view our child through the stranger's gaze, as Helen Featherstone so poignantly observed when she introduced her son to a potential babysitter. And she says, "I saw not the cheerful, handsome 7-year-old whom I care for every day, but a seriously deviant little boy who drools and makes strange, uninterpretable noises. The forgotten terrors of Jodi's babyhood surfaced. I saw my son as I might have seen another seriously handicapped child 7 years before." Now, it's well worth noting what exactly falls apart at these times. What falls apart is the vision of your child as the individual he or she is, and not as someone with the impairment he or she has. What falls apart is seeing yourself first as a parent, and not first as the parent of a disabled child. And here we come to the paradox at the heart of the normal. We want to be normal, but no one wants to be loved because they are normal. No one wants this Valentine. And it says, "You are so normal, please be my Valentine." This is the Valentine card from hell. The paradox dissolves when we understand that the normal serves as a backdrop against which the distinctive features of the individual emerges, the stage setting that makes the individual visible and intelligible to us. When you see another as abnormal, you can't see past that anomaly. The abnormality obliterates the individuality. Without the appreciation of another's individuality, there is no love. Without love, the possibility of a good life is immeasurably diminished. You are, the picture here of "You are so normal" dissolves, and it's replaced with a Valentine that says, "There is no one like you." The normal is not fixed, except if we decide it must be. Rigid norms close down possibilities and insist that those whose lives are different must be lives that are inferior. Walter Mischel, the noted psychologist at Columbia University, remarked as I spoke about my daughter that she had very good survival skills. I must have looked at him as if I thought he was insane. But he explained, "Sesha knows how to make people love her, and that is the most important survival skill of all." And I have here a picture of Sesha engagedly, smiling engagedly with others. Whatever capacity a person lacks, there are other people who can supply much that is functionally necessary. There is the possibility that we can invent gadgets and equipment to service the individual, and where nothing can compensate for the lost ability, there are other abilities that can be found and developed that allow for a rich life filled with joy and love and connectedness. We can do this when we're open to creating new and flexible norms and normals, when we're willing to see a missing capability as the occasion for new connections and new ways of experiencing the world that intensify the intact capacities, which in turn gives rise to joy. Severely cognitively disabled people make us look anew at what a truly human life is. We come to ask, granted that a society needs to be sufficiently productive to create enough wealth to live a comfortable life, but why must such productivity be required by all? How much of so-called productive activity is productive and of anything really important? Are we as independent as we pretend to be? And what about independence is really of value? What is full functioning, given the vast differences among human capabilities and potentials? We come to see how overvaluing rational capacities overshadows equally and more important human possibilities. Spinoza, the supreme rationalist, nonetheless gave joy pride of place. He wrote, "Joy is a man's passage from a lesser to a greater perfection. Even an examined life, if it holds no joy, may not be a life worth living. With joy, life has a point, a reason to be, a perfection of what it is to be." One of the deepest sources of joy that I see in my disabled child is her ability to be. Dave Hingsberg, an educator and writer on cognitive disability, wrote of the moment when he was facing death. He said he realized his to-do list was quite short, but his to-be list was very long. Being able to be quiet, good, happy, kind, to derive joy just from being alive and in the world is a rare gift. Love, joy, and the gift of just being able to be. I came to see this as I watched my aging mother, who's pictured here. My mother was a doer, sewing clothes, knitting, cooking, cleaning, caring for another, and proud of all she could do. As she began to lose her physical and mental capacities, she became increasingly embittered and longed for death. She needed care and refused it, as she was supposed to be the carer, the doer. In the last few months of her life, we managed to get some excellent caregivers, and she began to acquiesce and take pleasure from their caring and their company. She would go outside, sit on the seat of her walker, and look around, enjoying seeing the plants and trees, the children playing, the occasional breeze. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother just enjoying being. As she adapted to this last stage in her life, the resentment and bitterness left her. She faced her death with equanimity. Sasha had the wisdom my mother only acquired in the last few months of a long life. Roy Ginker writes that we should judge the value of a life not by what it can accomplish, but what it brings into the life of others. When I extol the virtues of being, I do not mean to foreclose the importance of skills, as Dave Hingsberg stresses. The skills are to be in the service of something the individual can be, to what can increase her joy, to love, to derive joy from life, to learn the wonder of being. This, I offer, is the apotheosis of a good life, one that everyone can achieve, even perhaps a philosopher. Thank you. Sorry that ran late.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.